Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about the Middle East. The very name itself is a historical accident, a relic of a time when European cartographers imagined themselves at the centre of the world, looking east to what they considered the middle of Asia. But for millennia, this region wasn't the middle of anything, it was the centre. The absolute, undeniable genesis point of much of what we consider civilization. Think about that paradox. A place so ancient, so foundational, that it gave us agriculture, cities, writing, laws, and the very concept of organized religion, yet is so often framed in modern discourse as a hotbed of new conflicts, a perpetual quote 3 to be solved. It's a region where the dust of forgotten empires still settles on bustling modern metropolises, where the echoes of the first human narratives whisper through the marketplaces of today. How can one place hold such a profound, unbroken lineage from the dawn of humanity to the complexities of the 21st century? It's a question that unravels an extraordinary tapestry of human ingenuity, ambition, and resilience. We're talking about the land between the rivers, the Fertile Crescent, the crossroads of continents, a place that didn't just witness history, but actively created it, often in ways that surprise us even today. This isn't just a story about ancient ruins, it's a story about the very foundations of human society. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Here's the thing that blows my mind about the Middle East. It's not just ancient, it's the ancient. This is the place where humanity stopped wandering and started building, where we decided to stop chasing our food and start planting it. A decision that fundamentally changed who we are. Think about the scale of that transformation. It's the moment our species took its first hesitant steps towards what we now call civilization. A shift so profound it still echoes in our daily lives. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, following herds and seasons. But around 12,500 BCE, something remarkable began to happen in the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean coast of what we now call the Middle East. People of the Natufian culture started settling down, not because they'd invented farming, but because the wild bounty of the region, abundant wild grains, nuts, and game, allowed them to. They built semi-subterranean circular houses, sometimes with stone foundations, and began creating elaborate cemeteries. Jericho, a name that resonates through millennia, was one such early settlement, boasting a massive stone tower and wall by 8000 BCE, long before true agriculture. These weren't just temporary camps, these were homes, places where generations returned. Then came the true game changer, the Neolithic Revolution, roughly between 10,000 and 4000 BCE. It wasn't a sudden event, but a slow, deliberate process of domesticating wild wheat and barley, goats and sheep. And the primary stage for this revolution was Mesopotamia, quote 4, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These two great rivers, flowing from the mountains of Anatolia to the Persian Gulf, didn't just provide water. Their annual floods deposited rich, fertile silt, creating an oasis of possibility in an otherwise arid landscape. This natural gift, combined with human ingenuity, laid the groundwork for everything that followed. By the Ubaid period, From about 6,500 to 4,100 BCE, we see the true beginnings of village life, with sophisticated irrigation systems and the construction of the very first monumental temples. Eridu, in southern Mesopotamia, is often cited as the oldest city in the world, a place of continuous human habitation that spans millennia. The sheer scale of the challenge and the brilliance of the solution in Mesopotamia is difficult to overstate. The rivers, while a blessing, were also capricious. Their floods were unpredictable, sometimes devastating. To harness their power, these early communities had to work together on an unprecedented scale. They dug long, intricate networks of irrigation canals, diverting water from the rivers to their fields. This wasn't a task for a single family or even a single village. It required coordinated effort from hundreds, then thousands of people. Who organized this massive undertaking? Who decided where the canals would go, who would dig, and how the water would be distributed? This collective effort, this necessity for cooperation beyond kinship, is arguably the very first form of government. It wasn't about kings with crowns yet, but about collective survival, resource management, and the emergence of a hierarchical structure to lead it. This organizational demand led directly to social stratification. Some people were better at managing water, others at leading labor, others still at communicating with the gods to ensure good harvests. Priests, who served at the heart of these early communities, became more than just spiritual guides. They were administrators, engineers, and economic managers. The temples, which began as simple shrines, grew into monumental structures, often rebuilt over and over on the same sacred spot. Eridu, for example, saw its temple rebuilt 18 times over 4,000 years, each new layer on top of the last, a testament to enduring devotion and community effort. Imagine the generational commitment, the sheer human will to continuously erect these structures from nothing but mud brick. These temples weren't just places of worship. They were the economic engines of the community, collecting offerings, storing surplus grain, and distributing resources. They were the original banks and granaries, cementing the central role of religion and its priestly class in the burgeoning society. Daily life for most revolved around farming, their mud brick homes, and the rhythm of the rivers and the temple. Pottery for storage, simple tools of stone and bone, later copper, were the material culture of an increasingly settled existence. The success of these irrigation systems, this unprecedented cooperation, led to a predictable outcome: surplus food. And surplus food led to population growth. Villages swelled into towns, and towns, in turn, began to coalesce into the first true cities. This ushered in the Uruk period, from roughly 4,100 to 2,900 BCE, named after the city that became the largest and most influential of its time, Uruk. This wasn't just a big town, it was a megacity, home to tens of thousands of people, sprawling over thousands of acres, boasting massive temple complexes like the Eanna district, dedicated to the goddess Inanna. To manage such a complex urban society, with its vast workforce, intricate economy, and diverse population, the human mind invented its most powerful tool: writing. Around 3,200 BCE, the first cuneiform tablets emerged from Uruk, not as literary masterpieces, but as administrative records, lists of grain, cattle, and workers. It was a practical solution to an overwhelming problem, but it fundamentally changed everything. allowing for complex laws, literature, and the very concept of recorded history. We've seen the long, slow crawl from scattered hunter-gatherers to the first settlements, then to the very cusp of urban civilization. With Uruk, we're not just talking about villages anymore. We're talking about complex societies, monumental architecture, and the very first written words. The invention of writing, this simple act of pressing a reed stylus into wet clay, didn't just allow them to keep track of grain, it allowed them to keep track of ideas, to codify laws, to tell stories that would outlive their creators by millennia. But the story of these first cities and the vibrant, often brutal empires they would spawn is only just beginning to take shape. Next, we'll dive into the world of the Sumerians, the true pioneers of civilization, and explore the astonishing world they built. Welcome back, history explorers. Last time, we journeyed through the incredible origins of settled life, the birth of cities like Uruk, and that mind-bending invention of cuneiform writing. We saw humanity literally building civilization from the ground up, brick by sun-baked brick, driven by the demands of the unforgiving yet fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. And now we dive headfirst into the era where these foundational ideas explode into a fully fledged complex society. We're talking about the Sumerians. If the Uruk period was the blueprint, the Sumerians were the master builders who took that blueprint and raised the very first skyscrapers of human culture. They are, without a shadow of a doubt, the true pioneers, the absolute game changers, the people who laid down so many of the fundamental structures that still echo in our lives today. Think about it. We're not talking about a handful of scattered villages anymore. We're talking about a thriving, dynamic tapestry of independent city-states, each a shining beacon of human ingenuity, each with its own patron deity, its own kings, its own armies, and its own fiercely proud identity. Imagine a landscape dotted with these powerful urban centres, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, and yes, even ancient Eridu, which continued to hold a profound spiritual significance as the very first city. Each of these wasn't just a place where people lived, it was a universe unto itself, a nexus of trade, religion, art, and innovation. Here's the thing that blows my mind about the Sumerians. They inherited the challenges and triumphs of their predecessors, and they didn't just adapt, they mastered them. The unpredictable rivers, the need for massive irrigation projects, the sheer organizational genius required to feed thousands, they took all of that and refined it into an art form. Their canals were engineering marvels, their agricultural output staggering. This wasn't just survival, this was flourishing. Let's talk about their contributions because they are staggering. First, and perhaps most famously, writing. We saw cuneiform emerge in Uruk as a tool for accounting, for keeping track of grain and sheep. But the Sumerians, they saw its true potential. They took those wedge-shaped marks and transformed them into a sophisticated system capable of capturing the full spectrum of human thought. We're talking about more than just ledgers now. We're talking about literature, about history, about laws, about prayers, about stories. This is where we get the Epic of Gilgamesh, considered by many to be the oldest surviving work of great literature in the world. Think about that for a second. Thousands of years before Homer penned the Iliad, the Sumerians were crafting tales of heroism, friendship, loss, and the eternal human quest for meaning and immortality. They were exploring themes that resonate with us today. It's a testament to their profound intellectual and emotional depth, and it's all thanks to those little wedge marks etched into clay tablets. This wasn't just a way to record, it was a way to remember, to reflect, to teach. It was the birth of recorded history, of documented thought, of a shared cultural narrative that could transcend generations. But the Sumerians weren't just poets and scribes. They were brilliant scientists and innovators. Their contributions to mathematics and astronomy are absolutely foundational. They developed a sexagesimal, base 60, number system. Why is that important? Because it's the reason we have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. Think about how deeply ingrained that is in our modern world. They meticulously observed the heavens, tracking the movements of stars and planets, not just for religious purposes, but to develop calendars, predict seasons, and understand the rhythms of their world. These were the first astronomers, mapping the cosmos with astonishing accuracy for their time. And what about technology? The Sumerians refined and popularized the wheel. While earlier forms of the wheel might have existed for pottery, the Sumerians were instrumental in developing it for transportation, revolutionizing trade and warfare. Imagine the sheer impact of being able to move heavy goods across long distances with relative ease. They also pioneered bronze metallurgy, mixing copper and tin to create a metal far stronger and more durable than pure copper. This wasn't just a fancy new material, it was a true game changer for tools, weapons, and art. It literally ushered in a new age, the Bronze Age. Then there's law and governance. With complex societies come complex problems, and the Sumerians were among the first to understand the need for codified laws. While Hammurabi's code often gets all the glory, the Sumerians had earlier legal codes, like the Code of Ur-Nammu, predating Hammurabi by centuries. These codes established principles of justice, property rights, and social order. They weren't perfect, but they were a monumental step towards a structured, predictable society, moving beyond arbitrary rule to a system of laws. Kingship, too, became more formalized, often seen as divinely sanctioned, a crucial link between the human and divine realms, responsible for the welfare of the city-state. And speaking of the divine, we can't talk about Sumer without talking about their religion and monumental architecture. The Sumerians were deeply spiritual, believing in a pantheon of gods and goddesses who controlled every aspect of the natural world and human destiny. Each city-state had its patron deity, and the temple to that deity was the absolute heart of the community, economically, spiritually, and politically. This is where the ziggurat comes in. If you've ever seen images of these colossal, stepped pyramids, you're looking at a Sumerian invention. These weren't just buildings. They were artificial mountains reaching towards the heavens, designed to bring the priests, and by extension the people, closer to their gods. Imagine standing at the base of one of these thousands of years ago, gazing up at its immense scale, knowing that the very fate of your city rested on the favour of the gods housed within. These ziggurats were not only places of worship, but also massive administrative centres, storehouses, and symbols of the city's power and devotion. They required immense resources, planning, and coordinated labour, a testament to the Sumerians' organizational prowess and their unwavering faith. So we have these incredible, innovative, vibrant city-states, each a hub of culture and progress. But here's the paradox, and it's one we'll see repeated throughout history. Innovation often breeds competition, and competition can lead to conflict. The very success of these independent city-states, their distinct identities, and their desire for resources and prestige often pitted them against one another. Warfare was constant, a brutal reality of life in Sumer, with cities rising and falling, borders shifting and alliances forming and breaking. And then there were the environmental challenges. The very irrigation systems that brought such prosperity also brought long-term problems. The relentless sun and the high evaporation rates led to the salinization of the soil over centuries. The land, once so fertile, slowly became less productive, a silent, creeping threat to the agricultural base that sustained these burgeoning urban centres. This combination of internal strife and environmental stress created vulnerabilities. The Sumerians, for all their brilliance, were about to face a new kind of challenge, the rise of empire. From within their own broader cultural sphere, a new power was coalescing, ready to unite or conquer, depending on your perspective, these proud, independent city-states under a single banner. We're talking about the rise of Akkad, and a figure who would cast a monumental shadow over the entire ancient world, Sargon. He wasn't Sumerian, but he emerged from the same crucible of Mesopotamia, a man who would take the foundational elements laid by the Sumerians and forge something entirely new, the world's very first true empire. But that, my friends, is a story for our next chapter. For now, pause and reflect on the sheer audacity of the Sumerians. They didn't just invent, they defined. They gave us writing, the wheel, complex law, monumental architecture, advanced mathematics, and the very idea of a shared cultural narrative. They built the bedrock upon which all subsequent civilizations in the Middle East, and indeed much of the world, would stand. If you're finding this journey into the cradle of civilization as fascinating as I am, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. What Sumerian invention blows your mind the most? Because for us it's just the beginning of truly understanding the entire magnificent and often brutal history of the Middle East. Welcome back to Dreamy History, where the dust of forgotten empires still settles on our screens and the echoes of the first human narratives whisper through the digital airwaves. Last time, we left you on the precipice, right at the edge of a monumental shift. We'd seen the Sumerian city-states, magnificent and innovative, yet constantly warring, exhausting themselves and grappling with the environmental challenges that threatened their very existence. They had built the foundations of civilization, but their fractured nature left them vulnerable. And that, my friends, is where our story takes its next dramatic turn. Because into this volatile, brilliant, and deeply human landscape steps a figure who will change everything, Sargon of Akkad. Here's what blows my mind about Sargon. He wasn't born into royalty. We're talking about a man who, according to legend, was found as a baby floating in a basket on the Euphrates, much like the later Moses. He started as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, a seemingly humble position. But Sargon was no ordinary cupbearer. He was a man with vision, ambition, and an iron will. He saw the disunity, the constant squabbling, the wasted potential of the Sumerian city-states, and he decided he was going to do something about it. Think about that for a second. In a world where power was traditionally inherited or seized through local strongmen, Sargon, this commoner, if such a term even applies to someone who could rise to cupbearer, dared to dream of something bigger. He wasn't just aiming for another city-state, he was aiming for unity. He gathered loyal followers, established his own capital city, Akkad, whose exact location is still debated by archaeologists today. A true ghost of history, yet its impact was monumental. And then he launched his campaigns. Sargon didn't just conquer, he transformed. He systematically marched through Mesopotamia, one city-state after another, bringing them under his dominion. Lagash, Umma, Uruk, the very heartlands of Sumerian civilization fell before his disciplined professional army. This wasn't just a band of local warriors. This was an organized military force, loyal to a central authority, a concept that was revolutionary for its time. He wasn't just content to exact tribute. He integrated these territories, creating something entirely new, the world's first true empire. Stop and let that sink in. The first empire. Before Rome, before Persia, before any other grand imperial project you can name, there was Akkad. This is the absolute, undeniable genesis point of centralized multi-city state rule. Sargon wasn't just a king, he was the king of Kish, the king of Sumer and Akkad, the king of the four quarters of the world. He wasn't just ruling a city, he was ruling a world, as they understood it. What did this mean for the people living in Mesopotamia? It meant a profound shift. For centuries, their lives had been defined by their city-state, their local gods, their local king. Now, they were part of something vast. Sargon established a centralized administration with governors loyal to him, not to their local city. He introduced standardized weights and measures, which, let me tell you, is a true game changer for trade and economic stability. Imagine trying to conduct business when every city uses a different system. He fostered empire-wide trade networks, extending Akkadian influence far beyond Mesopotamia, reaching as far as Anatolia and the Indus Valley. This wasn't just about military might, it was about economic integration and administrative genius. And then there's the language. While Sumerian continued to be used for religious and scholarly purposes, Akkadian, Sargon's Semitic language, became the language of administration, law, and everyday communication across the empire. This spread of a common language helped to knit together disparate peoples, fostering a sense of shared identity. However nascent, culturally the Akkadians adopted much from the Sumerians, their cuneiform writing system, their religious pantheon, though they incorporated their own deities and syncretized them, their architectural styles. But they also brought their own distinctive artistic flair, like the stunning bronze head, often attributed to Sargon himself, a masterpiece of ancient sculpture that conveys power, regality, and a chilling sense of authority. Sargon's reign, and that of his successors, especially his grandson Naram-Sin, was a period of unprecedented power and influence. Naram-Sin in particular took the concept of kingship to another level. He was the first Mesopotamian ruler to deify himself while still alive, presenting himself as a living god, a concept that would echo through future empires for millennia. Think about the sheer audacity. This wasn't just a divinely appointed king. This was a divine king, his famous victory stele depicting him trampling his enemies beneath his feet while wearing a horned helmet, a symbol previously reserved for gods, is a powerful testament to this new imperial ideology. But maintaining such a vast empire was an immense challenge. Rebellions were constant, fueled by the independent spirit of the conquered city-states. The sheer logistical nightmare of governing such a diverse and geographically spread out domain was immense. And then there were external pressures. Nomadic groups from the Zagros Mountains, particularly the Gutians, began to raid the empire's fringes, chipping away at its stability. Compounding these issues were environmental factors. The very agricultural bounty that had fueled Sumerian and Akkadian prosperity began to turn against them. Centuries of intensive irrigation, especially in the south, led to increased soil salinization. This meant lower crop yields, food shortages, and increased pressure on the administration. Some scholars even point to a major climatic event around 4,200 years ago, a mega-drought that impacted vast swathes of the globe, as a contributing factor to the empire's collapse. Imagine trying to hold an empire together when your primary food source is failing and your borders are under attack. Ultimately, the Akkadian Empire, for all its revolutionary grandeur, succumbed to these pressures. Around 2154 BCE, it collapsed, plunging Mesopotamia into a period of decentralization and, for some time, Gutian rule. This period is often described as a dark age, a time of disruption, less centralized control, and a decline in monumental building. But here's the thing about history, especially in this region. Nothing truly disappears. The Akkadian legacy, the idea of empire, of a universal ruler, of a centralized administration had been planted, and the Sumerians, who had been subsumed by Akkad, were not gone. Far from it. Out of the chaos following the Akkadian collapse and the expulsion of the Utians, a task largely credited to Utu-Hegel of Uruk, came a remarkable Sumerian resurgence, the third dynasty of Ur, or Ur III. This period, from roughly 2112 to 2004 BCE, is often seen as a final, glorious flourishing of Sumerian culture and political power. Under kings like Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi, the Sumerians built an empire that, while perhaps not as vast as Akkad's at its peak, was incredibly well organized and sophisticated. Ur-Nammu in particular is a figure of immense importance. He's famous for commissioning the Great Ziggurat of Ur, a magnificent step pyramid dedicated to the moon god Nanna, which still stands today as a testament to Sumerian architectural prowess and deep spirituality. But even more significantly, Ur-Nammu promulgated one of the earliest known law codes, predating Hammurabi's by several centuries. This code, like others that would follow, aimed to establish justice, protect the vulnerable, and regulate society, demonstrating a profound commitment to order and fairness. We're talking about concepts of jurisprudence that still resonate today. The Ur III period was a golden age for Sumerian culture. Art, literature, and mathematics flourished. The administration was incredibly bureaucratic, with detailed records of everything from agricultural output to the movement of goods, providing historians with an astonishing window into their daily lives. They perfected the irrigation systems, leading to immense agricultural productivity once again. It was as if Sumeria had taken the lessons of empire from Akkad and refined them, creating a highly centralized, prosperous, and culturally vibrant state. However, even this powerful resurgence couldn't last forever. The same challenges that plagued earlier empires began to re-emerge. Constant pressure from nomadic groups, particularly the Amorites from the west and the Elamites from the east, wore down the empire. The very bureaucracy that made III so efficient also made it rigid, and internal dissent simmered. Eventually, around 2004 BCE, the Elamites, in alliance with the Amorites, sacked Ur, bringing an end to the Third Dynasty and definitively to Sumerian political dominance in Mesopotamia. It's a bittersweet ending, isn't it? The Sumerians, the pioneers of civilization, whose innovations laid the groundwork for everything that followed, finally faded from the political stage. But their legacy? Oh, their legacy was just beginning its true journey. Their language, their literature, their gods, their laws, their cuneiform script, their mathematical systems, these would be adopted, adapted, and revered by successive empires for nearly 2 millennia. The death of Sumeria was, in many ways, its ultimate triumph, as its cultural DNA became woven into the very fabric of the Middle East. So, where does this leave us? The Sumerian dream of independent city-states, the Akkadian dream of a unified empire, the Ur-3 dream of a revived Sumerian Golden Age, all had run their course. Mesopotamia was once again decentralized, but it was a different kind of decentralization. The actors were changing. The Amorites, who had played a part in Ur's downfall, were now settling and rising to prominence, establishing new dynasties in cities like Babylon. And to the north, another power was slowly but surely beginning to stir, a power that would eventually become synonymous with military might and imperial ambition: Assyria. The stage is now set, my friends, for a new era, one where the echoes of Sumerian genius would mingle with new languages, new gods, and new, even more formidable empires. If you're enjoying this journey through the cradle of civilization, hit that like button and subscribe, because next time we're diving into the rise of the Amorites and the epic saga of Babylon. You won't want to miss it. Alright, buckle up, because if you thought the story of Mesopotamia was a roller coaster before, we're about to hit some serious loops and corkscrews. We left off with the glorious Ur-3 empire crumbling, sacked by the Elamites and the Amorites, leaving behind a power vacuum and a region in flux. The Sumerians, politically speaking, were done. Their language faded from common use, becoming a sacred tongue for scribes and priests, but their ideas, their innovations, oh, they were just getting started on their journey across the ages. Think about it. The blueprint for civilization had been drawn, tested, and refined. Writing, law, monumental architecture, complex administration, advanced mathematics. It was all there, waiting for the next ambitious group to pick up the torch. And pick it up they did. The early 2nd millennium BCE is a fascinating, messy, and incredibly fertile period. Imagine a chessboard where all the major pieces have just been swept off. Now, new players are cautiously moving their pawns. These weren't necessarily entirely new peoples, but often groups who had been on the fringes, or who had integrated with the existing populations now seizing their moment. One such group, the Amorites, pastoralists from the western deserts, had been steadily infiltrating Mesopotamia for centuries. They settled, they assimilated, they adopted Sumerian and Akkadian culture, and they began to establish dynasties in various city-states. And here's where one city, relatively minor for a long time, steps into the spotlight: Babylon. Yes, that Babylon. For centuries, It was just another town on the Euphrates, a regional centre. But under its Amorite kings, it began to grow, and then, around 1792 BCE, a king ascended its throne who would change everything. His name was Hammurabi. Here's what blows my mind about Hammurabi. He didn't inherit a massive empire. He started small with a modest kingdom. But this man was a true visionary, a military genius, and an administrative titan. He recognized the potential in the fragmented landscape of Mesopotamia. While other city-states like Larsa, Eshnunna, and Mari were squabbling, Hammurabi was patiently building his power, forging alliances and perfecting his military machine. He was playing the long game, my friends. Over the next 3 decades, through a brilliant combination of diplomacy and decisive warfare, Hammurabi systematically brought all of Mesopotamia under his control. He defeated Rimsin I of Larsa, a rival who had ruled for an incredible 60 years. He conquered Mari, a powerful city-state on the Euphrates that controlled crucial trade routes. He pushed back the Elamites, securing Mesopotamia's eastern flank. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi had forged the First Babylonian Empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to Assyria. Think about that sheer scale. He wasn't just conquering, he was unifying. A region that had been perpetually fragmented since the fall of Ur III. But Hammurabi's legacy isn't just about military might, as impressive as that was. No, what truly sets him apart is his administrative genius. He understood that an empire, to endure, needed more than just a strong army. It needed order, justice, and a coherent system of governance. He established a highly centralized bureaucracy, appointed governors loyal to him, and implemented a sophisticated tax system. He also undertook massive public works projects, digging and maintaining irrigation canals, vital for agriculture in Mesopotamia, building temples and fortifying cities. He was, in essence, the ultimate CEO of an ancient empire. And then, of course, there's the Code of Hammurabi. You've probably heard of it. Engraved on towering basalt stelae, like the one now housed in the Louvre Museum, it's one of the most famous and influential legal documents in human history. This wasn't just a collection of laws. It was a comprehensive legal system designed to regulate nearly every aspect of Babylonian society. Here's the thing that's truly revolutionary about it. Hammurabi wasn't just issuing decrees. He was presenting a codified set of laws, publicly displayed for all to see, or at least for the illiterate few to read and interpret. This was a monumental step towards the concept of the rule of law. The idea that everyone, from the highest noble to the lowest commoner, was subject to a common set of rules, and that justice should be administered impartially, at least in theory. The Code covers everything: property rights, family law, trade regulations, wages, loans, debt, and, famously, criminal justice. It introduced the principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which sounds harsh to our modern ears, but was actually a step forward in limiting vengeance and ensuring proportionate punishment. Instead of an endless blood feud, the punishment was prescribed and finite. Now, it's important to remember that this wasn't a universal code in the modern sense. It clearly distinguished between social classes, nobles, commoners, and slaves, and penalties varied accordingly. A noble harming another noble faced a different punishment than a noble harming a commoner, or a commoner harming a slave. but the fact that such a detailed written legal framework existed at all, applied across a vast empire, is absolutely astounding. It provided stability, predictability, and a foundation for social order that was unprecedented. It solidified Hammurabi's image as a just and righteous ruler, divinely appointed to bring order to the land. Under Hammurabi and his successors, Babylon entered a golden age. The city itself became a magnificent center of culture, learning, and trade. Babylonian scribes continued and expanded upon the Sumerian intellectual tradition. Their mathematics was incredibly advanced, capable of solving complex algebraic equations and understanding sophisticated geometric principles. They built upon Sumerian astronomical observations, developing precise calendars and charting the movements of celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy. This wasn't just for curiosity, it was deeply intertwined with their religious beliefs and their understanding of omens. Literature flourished too. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that incredible tale of friendship, loss, and the search for immortality, found its definitive form during the period, transcribed and refined by Babylonian scribes. Education was highly valued, with scribal schools churning out generations of literate administrators, priests, and scholars. We're talking about a society that truly valued knowledge and its practical application. The Amorite kings of Babylon, while respecting and integrating with the older Sumerian and Akkadian traditions, also brought their own flavors. They emphasized the god Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, elevating him to the head of the Mesopotamian pantheon. This wasn't just religious, it was a political statement, cementing Babylon's supremacy. But as we've seen time and again in this story, empires, no matter how grand, are ultimately fragile. After Hammurabi's long and prosperous reign, his successors struggled to maintain the vast empire. Internal rebellions flared up and external pressures mounted. The resources required to maintain such a large state were immense, and the control over distant provinces began to weaken. The final blow to the First Babylonian Empire came from an unexpected direction, around 1595 BCE. From the distant land of Anatolia, a new, formidable power emerged, the Hittites. These Indo-European speakers, with their mastery of chariots and iron metallurgy, a technology that would become a game-changer much later, launched a daring raid deep into Mesopotamia. Under their king Mursili I, they marched all the way to Babylon, sacked the city, and carried off the statue of Marduk, a devastating blow to Babylonian prestige and religious belief. This wasn't a conquest in the traditional sense. The Hittites didn't stay to rule. They raided, they plundered, and then they retreated. But their actions left Babylon utterly vulnerable. In the chaos that followed, another group, the Kassites, seized control. Who were the Kassites? That's a great question, and one historians are still piecing together. They were a people from the Zagros Mountains, east of Mesopotamia, and they established a dynasty that would rule Babylon for scalp. Over 400 years. Think about that. A longer period than the First Babylonian Empire itself. Their rule is often seen as a quieter, less well-documented era compared to the dramatic reigns of Sargon or Hammurabi. They respected Babylonian culture, continued many of its traditions, and brought a period of relative stability, albeit with less of the grand imperial expansion. They maintained trade relations across the ancient Near East, becoming a key player in what historians call the 14, a period of diplomatic correspondence between the great powers of the day. Meanwhile, in the north, other powers were rising. The Hurrians, another enigmatic group, established powerful kingdoms, most notably the Mitanni. The early Assyrians, who we briefly mentioned earlier, were also developing their own distinct identity and power base, though they wouldn't truly dominate the scene for a few more centuries. The Middle East was becoming a multipolar world, a complex web of competing kingdoms and empires, each vying for influence, trade, and resources. So, what have we seen? We've witnessed the rise of Babylon from obscurity to become the undisputed centre of Mesopotamia under the brilliant Hammurabi. We've explored his revolutionary legal code and the cultural flourishing of his empire, and we've seen how even the mightiest empires can fall, often to unexpected threats, paving the way for new dynasties and new players on the grand stage of history. The dust of forgotten empires still settles across this ancient landscape, but the echoes of their achievements continue to whisper. The foundations laid by the Sumerians, perfected by the Akkadians, and codified by the Babylonians, these were not just fleeting moments in time. They were the very bedrock upon which all subsequent civilizations in the Middle East, and indeed much of the world, would build. We're talking about the absolute undeniable genesis point of so much that we take for granted today. Next up, we're going to dive into a period of even greater complexity, where new empires will clash and the ancient world will be forever reshaped. If you're enjoying this journey through the cradle of civilization, hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Hammurabi's reign blows your mind the most? I'm always curious to hear your insights. Welcome back, history explorers, to another deep dive into the absolute foundational narrative of the Middle East. If you're enjoying this journey through time, do us a favor and hit that like button, subscribe, and tell a friend. We're talking about history that literally shaped the world, and we want everyone to experience this epic saga. Last time, we left you amidst a shifting landscape. The Hittites, those formidable warriors from Anatolia, had just delivered a stunning, albeit temporary, blow to Babylon, sacking the city around 1595 BCE. They raided, they pillaged, and then they retreated, leaving a power vacuum in their wake. Into that void stepped a fascinating, often overlooked group, the Kassites. These folks, hailing from the rugged Zagros Mountains, established a dynasty in Babylon that would rule for over 4 centuries. Think about that for a second. 400 years of relative stability after the chaos of the old Babylonian Empire's collapse. It's an incredible testament to their adaptability and their eventual assimilation into the rich tapestry of Mesopotamian culture. They adopted the language, the gods, the administrative systems. They essentially became Babylonians, ensuring the continuity of that ancient civilization. But while the Kassites were holding the reins in Babylon, other powers were stirring. Up in the north, in what is now northern Syria and southeastern Turkey, the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni was rising, a major force known for its mastery of chariot warfare and horse training. And further east, nestled around the city of Ashur, the early Assyrians were quietly, meticulously building their own strength. The stage, my friends, was being set for one of the most dynamic and interconnected periods in ancient history, the Late Bronze Age. Imagine, if you will, the world around 1400 BCE, We're not talking about isolated pockets of civilization anymore. Oh no, this is a truly international system, a vibrant and complex network of great powers. Think of it like a very exclusive club, with its members constantly vying for influence, trading goods, exchanging diplomatic niceties, and occasionally, engaging in massive world-changing battles. Who were the big players in this club? You had the mighty new kingdom of Egypt basking in its pharaonic glory. Then there were the Hittites, now solidified into a formidable empire known as Hatti, with their capital at Hattusa in central Anatolia. Mitanni held significant sway in the north. Kassite Babylon, though perhaps not as militarily aggressive as some of its neighbours, was a cultural and economic powerhouse. And the early Assyrians, though still finding their feet, were definitely a rising star on the horizon. What blows my mind about this period is the sheer level of interaction. We're talking about a sophisticated diplomatic system, complete with treaties, royal marriages designed to cement alliances, and an incredible exchange of luxury goods. Gold flowed from Egypt, silver from Anatolia, copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan. A truly globalized economy, if you can believe it. And how do we know all this? Well, here's where one of the most incredible archaeological discoveries comes into play. The Amarna letters. Picture this, a cache of over 300 clay tablets discovered in the late 19th century at Amarna, Egypt, the short-lived capital of Pharaoh Akhenaten. These weren't grand historical inscriptions. They were diplomatic correspondence, letters between pharaohs, Hittite kings, Babylonian rulers, Mitanni princes, and even various vassal states. And the language they wrote in, Akkadian, the very language of Sargon and Hammurabi, now serving as the lingua franca of international diplomacy across the entire ancient Near East. Think about that. A language that began in Mesopotamia became the language of power and communication for centuries across a vast region. It's absolutely wild. These letters reveal a world of intricate alliances, urgent requests for gold, complaints about insufficient gifts, and even pleas for military assistance. They show us kings addressing each other as brother, even as they subtly jockeyed for position and power. It's a fascinating glimpse into the human side of ancient geopolitics. Now, let's zoom in on a couple of these major players, starting with the Hittites. We mentioned their raid on Babylon, but by the late Bronze Age they were a truly organized empire. Their capital, Hattusa, was a heavily fortified city, a testament to their military prowess. They were innovators, particularly in chariot design and iron metallurgy. Though iron was still rare and precious at this time, their expansion brought them into direct confrontation with the biggest kid on the block, Egypt. The culmination of this rivalry was the Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE between the forces of Pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite king Muwatalli II. This wasn't just a battle, it was arguably the largest chariot battle in history, involving thousands of chariots thundering across the plains of what is now Syria. Imagine the dust, the noise, the sheer scale of it. Both sides claimed victory naturally, but in reality, it was a brutal stalemate. What's truly remarkable, though, is what happened after Kadesh. A few years later, Ramesses II and Hattusili III, Muwatalli's brother, signed the world's first known peace treaty. Not a surrender, not a tribute, but a mutual non-aggression pact and defensive alliance, engraved on silver tablets. Think about that paradox. After such a colossal clash, these empires chose diplomacy and cooperation. It's a powerful reminder that even in ancient times, leaders could recognize the futility of endless conflict and seek a different path. The Hittites also had a distinct legal tradition, different from Hammurabi's eye for an eye. Their laws often prescribed fines and reparations rather than physical retribution, which is a fascinating glimpse into their societal values. They had a rich mythology too, blending their own Anatolian deities with Mesopotamian and Hurrian influences. Meanwhile, the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni, initially a dominant force in northern Mesopotamia and Syria, found itself squeezed between the rising power of the Hittites to the west and the increasingly assertive Assyrians to the east. Mitanni was a powerful entity for a time, a real force multiplier in the region, largely due to their military technology and expertise. But empires rise and fall, and Mitanni eventually succumbed to the pressures from its powerful neighbours, particularly the Hittites, who decisively weakened them, opening the door for Assyrian expansion. And speaking of Assyrians, let's talk about their ascent. For a long time, the early Assyrians had been a regional power, sometimes independent, sometimes under the thumb of Mitanni. But with the weakening of Mitanni, a true game-changer emerged. King Ashur-uballit I, circa 1365 to 1330 BCE. He is often considered the founder of the Middle Assyrian Empire because he was the one who truly asserted Assyrian independence and began their territorial expansion. He even exchanged letters with the Egyptian pharaohs during the Amarna period, a clear sign of Assyria's elevated status on the international stage. The Assyrians, even at this early stage, were developing a reputation for military efficiency and brutal effectiveness. Fast forward a bit and we meet Tukulti-Ninurta I, circa 1243 to 1207 BCE, a truly fearsome Assyrian king. He didn't just expand Assyrian territory. He did something truly audacious. He conquered Babylon, the ancient heartland of Mesopotamia, and even captured the Kassite king. For a brief period, he sat on the throne of Babylon, a testament to Assyrian ambition and military might. The Kassite dynasty eventually regained control, but the message was clear. Assyria was a force to be reckoned with, a new heavyweight in the Great Power Club. However, even as these great empires, Egypt, Hatti, Kassite Babylon and Assyria, were at their zenith, engaging in diplomacy and warfare, something truly catastrophic was brewing. We're talking about one of the most enigmatic and widespread collapses in human history, the Bronze Age collapse. Imagine, if you will, a domino effect of epic proportions spanning from Greece to Mesopotamia, from Anatolia to Egypt. Around 1200 BCE, give or take a few decades, this entire interconnected system of empires, trade routes, and sophisticated urban centers collapsed. Cities were destroyed, trade networks dissolved, writing systems disappeared, and populations plummeted. It was a true dark age, a reset button pressed on an entire civilization. The causes of this collapse are still debated by historians and archaeologists, and honestly, that's part of what makes it so intriguing. Was it a perfect storm of factors? Almost certainly. We talk about the mysterious maritime raiders who swept across the Mediterranean, devastating coastal cities and clashing with Egypt. Who were they? Where did they come from? We still don't know for sure, but their impact was undeniable. Then there's the climate change hypothesis. Evidence suggests a period of severe drought, particularly in the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Imagine the impact of widespread crop failures on societies dependent on agriculture, already strained by massive populations and complex administrative structures. This would have led to famine, internal unrest, and mass migrations. We also consider internal rebellions, the breakdown of central authority, and the disruption of those vital trade routes for tin and copper, the very metals that defined the Bronze Age. If you can't get the raw materials for your bronze weapons and tools, your entire military and economic system is in trouble, and perhaps, lurking beneath it all, was the dawning of a new technological age. Iron. Bronze was expensive, requiring tin and copper, often sourced from far away. Iron, on the other hand, was more abundant and could be forged at higher temperatures, though it took time to master. The shift to iron metallurgy might have been a disruptive force, empowering smaller, more localized communities to forge their own tools and weapons, fundamentally changing the power dynamics. Egypt, though severely weakened and never quite regaining its former glory, managed to survive the initial onslaught of the Sea Peoples, but the Hittite Empire vanished. Its capital Hattusa burned and abandoned. Mitanni was gone. Kassite Babylon, already under pressure from rising Assyria and new threats from the east, like the Elamites, who finally sacked Babylon and ended Kassite rule around 1155 BCE, also entered a period of decline and fragmentation. The great powers, the club we just talked about, were shattered. The sheer scale of this collapse is almost incomprehensible. It was a global cataclysm for the ancient world, erasing entire cultures, disrupting knowledge, and forcing humanity to start anew in many respects. It's a stark reminder of the fragility of even the most complex and advanced societies. But here's the thing that always gives me goosebumps. Even in the darkest of dark ages, humanity finds a way. From the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse, new peoples, new technologies like iron, and new ways of organizing society would eventually emerge. The stage was being cleared, brutally and utterly, for the next act in the monumental drama of the Middle East. We're talking about a period of profound transformation, where the old gods and kings fell, making way for a new era of empires, one that would redefine warfare, administration, and the very concept of power. Next time, we're going to witness the phoenix-like rise of one of the most fearsome and influential empires the world has ever seen, an empire whose name still evokes images of military might and ruthless efficiency. You won't want to miss it. Stay curious, history fans, and we'll see you then. Welcome back, history explorers. If you've been with us on this incredible journey, then you know we just witnessed one of the most cataclysmic events in human history, the Bronze Age collapse. Picture it, this vast interconnected web of powerful empires, New Kingdom Egypt, the mighty Hittites, Mitanni, Kassite Babylon, even the nascent Assyrians, all brought to their knees, seemingly overnight, around 1200 BCE. The lights went out across the ancient world. Trade routes vanished, cities burned, entire civilizations simply disappeared. It was a true dark age, a reset button pressed with brutal force. We're talking about a void, a massive power vacuum, where the dust of forgotten empires still settled and the echoes of their grandeur faded into the windswept ruins. But here's the thing that blows my mind about human history, about our history. We are incredibly, stubbornly resilient. We don't just vanish, we adapt. We rebuild. And sometimes we come back harder, stronger, and in some cases far more terrifying than before. Out of that ashes, that period of profound uncertainty, a new age dawned. We call it the Iron Age. Think about the significance of that. Bronze, which we talked about so much, copper and tin, a relatively rare alloy, was the material of the elite. It was for weapons, tools, luxury items, often controlled by centralized powers. But iron ore is abundant. It's everywhere. And while it's harder to work, once you master the metallurgy, you can produce tools and weapons on a scale never before imagined. This wasn't just a technological upgrade, it was a societal democratizer. Suddenly, more people could afford metal tools, metal weapons. It changed warfare, changed agriculture, changed everything. In this fragmented world, new players emerged. Along the Mediterranean coast, the Phoenicians. Master mariners and traders started sailing the seas, establishing colonies, and, crucially, developing an incredibly efficient alphabetic writing system that would eventually influence Greek, Latin, and countless other scripts. And inland, the Arameans. Another Semitic-speaking people spread their language, Aramaic, through vast trade networks, eventually becoming the lingua franca of the entire Near East for centuries. Think about that paradox. A period of collapse leading to the spread of new forms of communication and trade that would literally shape the future. It's fascinating. But while these peoples were weaving new threads into the tapestry of civilization, one group was stirring in the tough, unforgiving lands of northern Mesopotamia. They had been there, on the fringes, for centuries. They had seen their own Middle Assyrian Empire rise and fall, battered by the Bronze Age collapse. But unlike the Hittites, they hadn't vanished. They had held on. They had learned. And they were about to become the most dominant, fearsome, and frankly brutal empire the world had ever seen. We're talking, of course, about the Neo-Assyrian Empire. If you thought Sargon of Akkad was a game-changer, if you thought Hammurabi was a force to be reckoned with, prepare yourselves. Because the Assyrians of the Iron Age were a different beast entirely. They took the concept of empire, of centralized power, of military might, and they cranked it up to 11. How did they do it? Well, imagine living in a region constantly under threat. To their north, mountain tribes. To their south, the ever-resurgent Babylonian city-states. To their west, the new Aramean kingdoms. This was not a cushy existence. This was a constant fight for survival. And that constant pressure forged them into something utterly unique. A society absolutely obsessed with military efficiency and expansion. The early kings of the Neo-Assyrian revival, like Ashur-dan II and Gadad-Nirari II, began the slow, painful process of rebuilding Assyrian power in the 10th and 9th centuries BCE. They pushed back against the Arameans, securing their borders, and slowly, painstakingly started to expand. But it was under Ashurnasirpal II, reigned 883 to 859 BCE, that the true terrifying character of the Neo-Assyrian Empire truly emerged. Ashurnasirpal II was a military genius. Yes, but he was also a master of psychological warfare. His annals carved into stone are not just records of his conquests. They are chilling declarations of intent. They describe in graphic detail the fate of those who dared to defy Assyria. Cities razed, populations deported, leaders flayed alive and their skins nailed to city walls, impalements, mountains of skulls. We're talking about a deliberate, systematic policy of terror designed to break the will of any potential enemy before they even thought about resisting. Think about that. They understood the power of fear as a weapon, wielded with surgical precision. This was no random brutality. This was calculated. It was meant to make an example, to spread a message. Resist us, and your suffering will be unimaginable. Submit, and you might live. This strategy worked. Neighbouring kingdoms, hearing these accounts, often capitulated without a fight. Ashurnasirpal II also moved the capital to Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud, where he built a magnificent new palace, adorned with stunning reliefs depicting his victories and hunting prowess. These colossal lamassu, winged human-headed bulls, guarded the palace gates, symbols of the king's power and divine protection. It was a statement. Assyria was back, and it was grander, more powerful, and more intimidating than ever. His son, Shalmaneser III, reigned 859 to 824 BCE, continued this relentless expansion, pushing Assyrian armies further west into Syria and the Levant. He famously clashed with a coalition of local kings, including Ahab of Israel and Hadadezer of Aram Damascus, at the Battle of Karkar in 853 BCE. Though the battle was indecisive, Shalmaneser still claimed victory, and the constant pressure he exerted weakened these smaller states, paving the way for future Assyrian dominance. But the real game-changer, the true architect of the imperial system, was Tiglath-Pileser III Bak. Reigned 745 to 727 BCE. This guy was an absolute visionary. He looked at the vast territories Assyria was conquering and realized that simply raiding and extracting tribute wasn't enough. He needed to create a truly integrated empire. So he completely reformed the Assyrian state. He reduced the power of the old Assyrian nobility, centralizing authority firmly in the hands of the king. He professionalized the army, creating a standing force that was not just a militia called up for campaigns, but a permanent, highly trained, multi-ethnic fighting machine equipped with the latest iron weapons, sophisticated siege engines, and swift chariots. He pioneered the use of cavalry on a large scale. This was an army unlike anything the world had ever seen. And here's the crucial innovation. Instead of just demanding tribute, Tiglath-Pileser III began a policy of annexation. Conquered territories weren't just vassals. They became provinces, directly administered by Assyrian governors. He also systematized the policy of mass deportation. Entire populations, skilled artisans, farmers, even whole cities, were uprooted from their homelands and resettled in other parts of the empire. This wasn't just punishment. It was a deliberate strategy to break local identities, prevent rebellion, and integrate diverse populations into a single, loyal imperial workforce. Imagine the sheer logistical might required to move tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of people across vast distances. It's mind-boggling. Under Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyria conquered the Neo-Hittite states in Anatolia, subdued the mighty kingdom of Urartu, crushed the Aramean states, and brought Babylon under its direct control. He even forced tribute from Egypt. The map of the Middle East was rapidly being redrawn in Assyrian red. His successors continued this relentless expansion. Sargon II. reigned 722 to 705 BCE, who may have been a usurper but certainly proved his imperial mettle, captured the Israelite capital of Samaria in 722 BCE, leading to the famous deportation of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. He founded a magnificent new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, modern-day Khorsabad, another testament to Assyrian power and ambition. Then came Sennacherib, reigned 705 to 681 BCE, a truly imposing figure. He famously sacked Babylon after a series of rebellions, diverting rivers to flood its ruins, attempting to erase it from the map. Though he later regretted it, or his successors did, it shows the absolute ruthlessness of Assyrian policy. He then turned his attention to the Levant, besieging Jerusalem during the reign of King Hezekiah, an event dramatically recounted in the Bible. While Jerusalem was miraculously spared, from the biblical perspective, Sennacherib's campaign devastated Judah. He also moved the capital again, this time to the ancient city of Nineveh, which he transformed into one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world, complete with vast palaces, temples, and an elaborate system of aqueducts to bring water from distant mountains. His son, Esarhaddon, reigned 681 to 669 BCE, took the empire to its absolute territorial peak. He rebuilt Babylon, reversing his father's destructive policies, and then, in a stunning display of military might, he marched his armies across the Sinai Desert and conquered Egypt. Think about that. The land of the pharaohs, the ancient civilization that had stood for millennia, now fell under the heel of Assyria. This was an empire stretching from the Nile to the Zagros Mountains, from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. It was truly unprecedented in scale and control. And then we have Ashurbanipal, reigned 669 to 631 BCE, the last great king of Assyria. He was a formidable warrior, crushing a major rebellion led by his own brother, who ruled Babylon as a vassal, and utterly destroying the troublesome Elamite kingdom. But here's where the Assyrian paradox truly shines. Ashurbanipal wasn't just a brutal conqueror, he was also a scholar, a patron of arts and letters, and an intellectual giant. He assembled the famous Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, arguably the most important archaeological discovery for understanding ancient Mesopotamia. This library contained tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, meticulously catalogued, preserving the knowledge, literature, and religious texts of millennia, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, astronomical observations, legal codes, and historical records. Think about that for a moment. The empire that perfected terror, that systematically destroyed cultures and deported populations, was also the empire that, through the intellectual curiosity of its last great king, preserved the very history and literature of the civilizations it subjugated. It's a stunning contradiction, isn't it? The same hands that wielded the iron sword also held the stylus, meticulously copying ancient wisdom onto clay tablets. The Neo-Assyrian Empire at its height was a marvel of administration, military organization, and engineering. It was the first true quote 20 uniting vast and diverse peoples under a single centralized authority. It developed sophisticated road networks, a postal system, and a highly efficient bureaucracy. Its military innovations would be studied and adapted by future empires for centuries. But beneath the surface of this awe-inspiring, terrifying colossus, cracks were beginning to show. The sheer scale of the empire, the constant warfare, the brutal suppression of dissent, it all took a toll. The conquered peoples, while subdued, were simmering with resentment. The empire was overstretched, its resources strained, its armies constantly campaigning. The stage was set, once again, for a dramatic shift. The Assyrians had cleared the board with unprecedented ruthlessness, but in doing so they had also created the conditions for new powers to rise from the ashes of those they had crushed. And as we'll see, the very brutality that made them so successful would also sow the seeds of their spectacular downfall. The echoes of their conquests still resonate across the Middle East, a powerful, chilling reminder of the cyclical nature of power and the enduring human capacity for both destruction and monumental achievement. Stay with us, because the story of how this colossal empire met its end and what came next is just as epic. We left the Neo-Assyrian Empire at its zenith, a behemoth straddling the ancient world, its shadow stretching from Egypt to the Zagros Mountains. Ashurbanipal, a king of paradoxes, ruled from his magnificent palace in Nineveh, building libraries while his armies crushed all dissent. But here's the thing about empires built on fear, on the systematic terror we talked about last time. They create enemies faster than they can conquer them. They sow the seeds of their own destruction in the very soil they claim to dominate. Think about it. The sheer, constant warfare required to maintain such a vast dominion, the relentless drain on resources, both human and material, the brutal policies of mass deportation and public torture, while effective in the short term, fueled an incandescent resentment in every conquered territory. We're talking about a boiling cauldron of suppressed fury, just waiting for a spark, and that spark came. The mighty Neo-Assyrian Empire, despite its unparalleled military machine and sophisticated administration, began to unravel from within and without. Ashurbanipal's death around 627 BCE plunged the empire into a succession crisis, a common Achilles heel for even the strongest states. This internal instability was the signal the long-suffering peoples had been waiting for. Suddenly, the peripheral powers, those who had been grinding under the Assyrian heel for decades, saw their chance. From the east, the Medes, a formidable Indo-Iranian people who had been consolidating their power, began to push westward. And from the south, a new resurgent power emerged from the ancient heartland of Mesopotamia, the Chaldeans, a Semitic people who had settled in Babylonia. Under the leadership of Nabopolassar, a Chaldean general, Babylon declared its independence from Assyrian rule. This wasn't just another rebellion. This was an alliance of vengeance. The Medes, under King Cyaxares, and the Chaldeans of Babylon united in a common cause to utterly dismantle the Assyrian Empire. Can you imagine the sheer terror that must have gripped Nineveh as the combined armies advanced? The city, once thought impregnable, fell in 612 BCE after a brutal siege. The scale of the destruction was immense, so complete that for centuries people doubted Nineveh had ever existed. This wasn't just a defeat, it was an annihilation. The heart of the Assyrian beast was torn out, and its vast empire collapsed with astonishing speed. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief, though perhaps only for a moment. From the ashes of Assyria's collapse, a familiar name rose to prominence: Babylon. But this wasn't the old Babylon of Hammurabi. This was the Neo-Babylonian Empire, often called the Chaldean Empire, and it was about to embark on its own spectacular, if relatively brief chapter in history. Nabopolassar laid the groundwork, but it was his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who would truly elevate Babylon to legendary status. Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 605 to 562 BCE, was a conqueror, a builder, and a visionary. He inherited a vast chunk of the former Assyrian Empire, and he wasted no time in consolidating and expanding it. His military campaigns were relentless, pushing the Neo-Babylonian borders to their greatest extent. He famously campaigned in the Levant, clashing with Egypt for control of the region, and crucially dealing with the rebellious kingdom of Judah. Here's where we get to one of the most impactful events in Judeo-Christian history: the destruction of Jerusalem. After multiple revolts, Nebuchadnezzar finally laid siege to Jerusalem in 587 or 586 BCE. The city fell, the Temple of Solomon was destroyed, and a significant portion of the Jewish population was deported to Babylon. This wasn't just a military conquest. It was a profound cultural and religious trauma, known as the Babylonian captivity or Babylonian exile. But it was also a crucible, a period that profoundly shaped Jewish identity, theology, and the very texts of the Hebrew Bible. Think about the paradox: a moment of immense suffering that ultimately forged a people's enduring faith and written tradition. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just a warrior. Oh no, this king was an architect on an epic scale. He transformed Babylon into one of the most magnificent cities the world had ever seen. We're talking about monumental construction projects that still capture our imaginations today. He rebuilt and expanded the city walls, making them virtually impenetrable. He adorned the processional way with the stunning Ishtar Gate, a dazzling masterpiece of glazed brick depicting lions, bulls, and dragons, whose vibrant colours and intricate designs would have been absolutely breathtaking. If you've ever seen it in a museum, you know it's still breathtaking today. And then there are the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Whether they were a real tiered garden structure built for his homesick Median wife, Amytis, or perhaps a misattribution of the terraced gardens of Nineveh, or even a poetic fancy, the very idea of them speaks to the ambition and grandeur of Nebuchadnezzar's vision. He also massively expanded the Etemenanki, the great ziggurat dedicated to the god Marduk, which is widely believed to be the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel. Imagine that, a 7-tiered colossal structure rising into the Mesopotamian sky, a testament to human aspiration and divine connection. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon experienced a cultural renaissance. Astronomy, mathematics, and literature flourished. The city became a vibrant centre of learning and trade, a true jewel of the ancient world. But like all empires, even one built on such splendour, the Neo-Babylonian era was destined to be fleeting. After Nebuchadnezzar's long and glorious reign, a series of weaker rulers followed, plagued by internal power struggles and an inability to maintain the empire's vast territories. The last independent king of Babylon was Nabonidus, a rather eccentric figure who spent much of his reign in the Arabian desert, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule in his stead. This created further instability and resentment among the Babylonian elite and priests. The stage was set for another colossal shift, another empire to rise from the ashes of its predecessors, And this time, the player was from a region we haven't spent much time on yet, but one that would become absolutely pivotal: Persia. Enter Cyrus the Great. This is where the story gets really interesting, because Cyrus wasn't just another conqueror, he was a revolutionary. He was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, the first truly global empire, and his approach to governance was radically different from the Assyrian model of terror. Cyrus began his rise in the mid-6th century BCE, starting as a vassal king of Anshan, a small kingdom in what is now southwestern Iran, under the dominion of the Medes. But Cyrus was no ordinary vassal. He rebelled against his Median overlord, Astyages, and in a stunning turn of events, not only defeated the Medes but assimilated them into his own growing empire. This was his first masterstroke. Rather than destroying the Median capital, Ecbatana, he preserved it, integrating Median nobles into his administration. This policy of integration, rather than annihilation, would become a hallmark of his rule. Next, Cyrus turned his attention westward to the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia, ruled by the legendary King Croesus, whose name is still synonymous with immense wealth. The Lydians, famous for inventing coinage, were a formidable power, but Cyrus, with characteristic speed and military genius, defeated Croesus and incorporated Lydia into his empire around 547 BCE. This conquest gave Persia control of western Anatolia and access to the Aegean Sea, bringing them into direct contact with the burgeoning Greek city-states. But the ultimate prize, the glittering jewel of Mesopotamia, was still Babylon. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, as we discussed, was weakened by internal dissent and the unpopularity of King Nabonidus. In 539 BCE, Cyrus marched on Babylon. And here's what makes this conquest so unique. It wasn't a brutal, destructive siege like Nineveh. According to various accounts, including the famous Cyrus Cylinder, the Persian army entered Babylon peacefully, seemingly welcomed by a populace disillusioned with their own king. The Cyrus Cylinder, a clay cylinder inscribed with a cuneiform declaration, is a truly remarkable artifact. It portrays Cyrus not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator chosen by Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, to restore order and justice. It details his policy of allowing deported peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples, a direct contrast to the Assyrian and Babylonian policies of forced relocation. This included the Jewish exiles, who were permitted to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, an event profoundly celebrated in biblical texts. This wasn't just a pragmatic move, it was a profound declaration of a new kind of imperial rule, one based on respect for local customs and religions, not forced assimilation. Think about that paradox for a moment. An empire built not solely on conquest, but on a form of benevolent tolerance. It's a game changer in the history of imperial governance. Under Cyrus and his successors, particularly Darius I, who reigned 522 to 486 BCE, the Achaemenid Empire became an administrative marvel. It stretched from the Aegean Sea in the west to the Indus Valley in the east, encompassing a mind-boggling diversity of cultures, languages, and religions. How did they manage this colossal undertaking? Darius I, often called, quote, 21, quote, was an organizational genius. He divided the empire into administrative provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap, a local governor often chosen from the conquered nobility, but crucially overseen by royal inspectors. The Musses quote tastintu saint-uverns to prevent corruption and rebellion. This system ensured both local autonomy and centralized control. He standardized coinage, introduced Aramaic as the official administrative language across the empire, and built an incredible network of roads, most famously the Royal Road, which stretched over 1,600 miles from Susa to Sardis. This road facilitated rapid communication and trade, allowing royal messengers to travel its entire length in just a week, an astonishing feat for the ancient world. It was the internet of its day, connecting the vast reaches of the empire. The Achaemenid Persians also embraced Zoroastrianism, an ancient monotheistic or dualistic religion founded by the prophet Zoroaster. While not forced upon their subjects, its ethical principles of good versus evil, truth versus falsehood, and the importance of choice likely influenced Persian imperial ideology, reinforcing ideas of justice and order. The Achaemenid Empire represented a new paradigm in world history, a truly multicultural, multi-ethnic empire, unified not by terror alone, but by a sophisticated administrative system, a relatively tolerant religious policy, and a network of infrastructure that connected disparate peoples like never before. It was a testament to the ingenuity of humanity, capable of building not just cities, but entire worlds. And it set the stage for the next great clashes that would shape the Middle East and beyond, the epic encounters between East and West, between Persia and the rising powers of the Greek city-states. But that, my friends, is a story for our next chapter. All right, dreamy history explorers, we left off with Darius the Great, architect of an empire so vast, so meticulously organized, it truly earned the title. Quote 23. From the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia to the fertile Nile, from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean Sea, the Achaemenid Persian Empire was a force of nature, an administrative marvel, a testament to what centralized power and a policy of relative tolerance could achieve. We're talking about an empire that, for the first time, truly connected disparate cultures under one unified vision. But even the greatest empires, with all their roads, satrapies, and standardized coinage, eventually bump up against something new, something different. And for the Persians, that something different was about to explode into a conflict that would shape not just the Middle East, but the entire trajectory of Western civilization. Imagine the sheer scale of it. This colossal Persian empire stretching across continents, suddenly finding its ambitions checked by a collection of relatively tiny, fiercely independent city-states clustered on the edge of the Aegean. These were the Greeks, and they were about to become Persia's greatest challenge. The first sparks of this monumental clash weren't even on mainland Greece itself. Oh no, history loves to start small, doesn't it? The trouble brewed in the Greek cities along the coast of Anatolia, what we call Ionia today. These Ionian Greeks had been brought under Persian rule, and while the Persians generally allowed them to maintain their customs, they also installed local tyrants, often Greek themselves, loyal to the great king. Now, if you know anything about the Greeks, you know they loved their independence. They chafed under foreign rule, even if it was light. So, around 499 BCE, these Ionian cities, fueled by a desire for self-determination and perhaps a little encouragement from Athens, rose up in what we call the Ionian Revolt. It was a messy, brutal affair. Athens, feeling a nascent sense of pan-Hellenic solidarity, or perhaps just seeing an opportunity to tweak the nose of a superpower, sent a small fleet to aid the rebels. They even managed to burn Sardis, a major Persian city. Here's the thing that blows my mind. From the Persian perspective, this was a minor provincial rebellion, an annoyance. But for Darius, that act of burning Sardis, aided by Athens, was an insult that simply could not stand. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the great king, an act of defiance that demanded a response. And respond he did. The revolt was eventually crushed, but the seeds of a much larger conflict had been sown. Darius was not one to forget. He reportedly had a servant remind him daily, quote, 25 talk about holding a grudge. So, in 492 BCE, Darius launched his first major expedition against Greece. His goal: punish Athens and Eretria for their meddling, secure the Aegean, and perhaps expand his empire further into Europe. His forces swept through Thrace and Macedon, bringing them under Persian control, but a storm off Mount Athos decimated his fleet, forcing a retreat. Undeterred, Darius tried again in 490 BCE. This time his forces landed at Marathon, a plain about 26 miles from Athens. The Athenians, vastly outnumbered, faced a seemingly insurmountable foe. But here's where the story takes a legendary turn. The Greeks, led by the general Miltiades, employed brilliant tactics, attacking the Persian flanks and routing their much larger army. The Battle of Marathon was an absolute shocker. It was the first time the Persians had been decisively defeated on European soil, and it proved that the seemingly invincible Persian war machine could be beaten. Think about that paradox for a moment. A tiny city-state, a nascent democracy, standing against the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, and winning. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological triumph. It cemented the idea of Greek exceptionalism, of their unique ability to defend freedom against tyranny. It's the moment when, for many, the West truly begins to define itself against the East. Darius, furious at this unexpected setback, immediately began planning an even larger invasion, a truly overwhelming force. But fate, as it often does, intervened. Darius died in 486 BCE before he could launch his revenge. Enter his son, Xerxes I. Now, Xerxes inherited not just the vast Persian Empire, but also his father's burning desire for vengeance against the Greeks, and he planned for it on a scale that beggars belief. We're talking about an invasion force so immense, so gargantuan, that ancient historians struggled to accurately convey its size. Herodotus, our primary source, speaks of millions. While modern historians debate the exact numbers, everyone agrees it was an unprecedented undertaking, a multi-ethnic, multilingual army and navy, drawn from every corner of the Persian Empire. Xerxes' preparations were legendary. He ordered the construction of a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, linking Asia to Europe, an engineering feat of staggering proportions. He dug a canal through the Athos Peninsula, a testament to his determination to avoid his father's earlier naval disaster. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a statement. It was the great king demonstrating his absolute power, bending nature to his will. In 480 BCE, Xerxes led his forces into Greece. The Greeks, finally uniting, though not without internal squabbles, because, well, they're Greeks. decided to make a stand at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. And this, my friends, is where one of the most iconic stories in all of history unfolds. A small force of Greek hoplites, famously led by 300 Spartans under King Leonidas, held off the entire Persian army for 3 days. It was a suicidal mission, a delaying tactic, but its impact was immeasurable. The Spartans fought to the last man, giving the rest of Greece crucial time to prepare and galvanizing the Hellenic spirit. Quote, 28. That epitaph still sends shivers down my spine. It wasn't about winning the battle, it was about the message it sent, that even against overwhelming odds, freedom was worth dying for. The Persians eventually broke through, sacked Athens, which had been evacuated, and burned the Acropolis, a devastating blow to Greek pride. It looked like the end, but the Greeks had a secret weapon, their navy. Under the brilliant leadership of the Athenian general Themistocles, the Greek fleet lured the massive Persian navy into the narrow straits of Salamis. This was a stroke of genius. The sheer size of the Persian fleet, which had been an advantage in open water, became a liability at the confined space. The smaller, more maneuverable Greek triremes, powered by skilled rowers, rammed and sank Persian ships by the hundreds. The Battle of Salamis was a crushing defeat for the Persian navy. Xerxes, watching from a golden throne on the shore, witnessed the destruction of his naval power. With his supply lines threatened and his grand invasion plan in tatters, he decided to retreat with a significant portion of his army, leaving his general Mardonius to continue the fight on land. But the tide had turned. In 479 BCE, the remaining Persian land forces, under Mardonius, were decisively defeated at the Battle of Plataea by a united Greek army. Simultaneously, the Greek fleet achieved another victory at Mycale, destroying the remnants of the Persian navy. The Persian wars were over, and the Greeks had won. Think about the sheer audacity of that outcome, the mightiest empire on earth, humbled by a collection of independent city-states. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a cultural watershed. It fostered a deep sense of Greek identity, a belief in their unique form of governance, democracy, though not universal, and their intellectual superiority. It's often framed as the moment democracy triumphed over despotism, though, as always, history is far more nuanced than simple binaries. But the impact on the Greek psyche, and by extension on the future of Western thought, was profound. The immediate aftermath saw Athens rise to unprecedented power. With the threat of Persia still looming, many Greek city-states formed the Delian League, an alliance ostensibly created to continue the fight against Persia. Athens, with its powerful navy, quickly became the dominant force in this league, effectively transforming it into an Athenian empire. This period, the Golden Age of Athens, saw an explosion of philosophy, art, drama, and architecture. Think the Parthenon, Socrates, Plato, Sophocles. It was a direct consequence of their victory and newfound wealth. Meanwhile, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, though defeated in Greece, remained incredibly vast and powerful. The wars had been costly, yes, and a blow to their prestige, but they hadn't fundamentally shattered the empire. Persia simply shifted its strategy. Instead of direct invasion, it began to play a subtler game, using its immense wealth to fund various Greek city-states against each other, particularly Athens and Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. We call it, quote, 29, quote, and the Persians were masters of it. They effectively dictated terms to the squabbling Greeks for decades, culminating in the King's Peace, or Peace of Antalcidas, in 387 BCE, where Persia, astonishingly, guaranteed the autonomy of the Greek city-states in mainland Greece while reclaiming its dominion over the Ionian Greeks. Imagine that, the great king dictating the terms of peace to the Greeks decades after their victory. It shows you just how resilient and influential Persia remained. But even with this continued influence, the Persian Empire was slowly, subtly beginning to show cracks. The sheer scale of it, the constant need to suppress revolts, the lavish lifestyles of its kings, the internecine struggles for power within the royal court, all of this took its toll. There were assassinations, usurpers and satraps who grew increasingly independent. The administrative efficiency of Darius I began to fray, and as Persia, still immense but perhaps a little less cohesive, continued its grand game of diplomacy and occasional intervention in the Greek world, a new power was quietly, almost imperceptibly, rising on the northern periphery of Greece. Macedon. For centuries, Macedon had been considered a semi-barbaric backwater by the more civilized Greeks of Athens and Sparta. But that was about to change dramatically. Enter Philip II of Macedon. This man was an absolute visionary, a military genius, and a political pragmatist. He reformed the Macedonian army, creating the formidable Macedonian phalanx, a dense formation of soldiers armed with long pikes, sarissas, that would revolutionize warfare. He was a master of diplomacy, bribery, and siegecraft. Through a combination of military might and cunning diplomacy, Philip systematically unified the fractious Greek city-states under Macedonian hegemony. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, where Philip's forces crushed a combined army of Athens and Thebes. Greece, for the first time, was essentially united under a single power, and Philip wasn't content to stop there. His ultimate ambition, the grand plan he had been meticulously laying, was to lead a united Greek army across the Hellespont and invade the Persian Empire. He framed it as a pan-Hellenic crusade, a revenge for the Persian Wars, but it was undoubtedly a war of conquest, driven by Macedonian ambition and the allure of Persian wealth. Think about the sheer audacity of this plan, to take on the empire that had once threatened to engulf Greece, to turn the tables and invade their heartland. It was a dream that had simmered in the Greek consciousness for over a century. But, as with Darius before him, fate had other plans for Philip. In 336 BCE, just as he was preparing to launch his grand invasion, Philip II was assassinated under mysterious circumstances. A massive blow, a sudden halt to what seemed like an unstoppable momentum. Except it wasn't a halt, because Philip had a son, a young man barely 20 years old, who had already proven himself a brilliant military commander and a student of Aristotle. A man who would not just inherit his father's dream, but would amplify it, transcend it, and redefine the very boundaries of the known world. His name was Alexander, and he was about to unleash a storm that would forever reshape the Middle East. If you thought the Persian Wars were epic, buckle up, because what's coming next is going to blow your mind. The stage is set, the players are in place, and the greatest conqueror the ancient world had ever seen is about to step onto the scene. We're talking about a transformation of empires, cultures, and the very concept of global power. Get ready because the Hellenistic age is knocking and it's about to kick the door down. Alright, buckle up, because if you thought the story of empires rising and falling was intense, we're about to witness one of history's most meteoric, utterly mind-blowing ascents. Philip II is gone, assassinated, and suddenly, the grand ambition to invade Persia falls to his son, a young man barely 20 years old who would become known as Alexander the Great. Think about that for a second. 20 years old. Most of us are barely figuring out how to do laundry at that age, let alone inheriting a unified Greece and a meticulously planned invasion of the world's largest empire. But Alexander wasn't just any 20-year-old. He was a student of Aristotle, a military prodigy, and a man convinced of his own divine destiny. He immediately consolidated his power, ruthlessly crushing any Greek city-state that dared to think about rebellion, looking at you, Thebes. And then, with Greece firmly under his heel, he turned his gaze east. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, with a relatively modest army of about 40,000 men. This wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a deeply symbolic act. He reportedly threw his spear into Asian soil, claiming it by right of conquest, and visited the tomb of Achilles, his legendary ancestor, to invoke heroic destiny. He wasn't just invading, he was reenacting ancient myths. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, still vast and powerful, wasn't exactly quaking in its boots. They dealt with Greek incursions before, but they hadn't dealt with Alexander. His first major test came at the Battle of Granicus River. The Persian satraps and their Greek mercenary forces vastly outnumbered him, but Alexander's tactical brilliance, his legendary companion cavalry, and his personal bravery, he fought on the front lines, nearly dying multiple times, secured a decisive victory. This wasn't just a win, it was a statement. It opened up Asia Minor, and as he marched south, he liberated the Greek cities along the coast, effectively cutting the Persian Empire off from its navy. Here's the thing about Alexander. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a master of propaganda. He presented himself not as an invader, but as a liberator, freeing the Greek cities from Persian rule, and portraying his campaign as a crusade of revenge for the Persian Wars a century and a half earlier. It was brilliant. His march continued, a relentless, unstoppable force. But the real showdown, the one everyone anticipated, came in 333 BCE at the Battle of Issus. This was it. Alexander, facing the full might of the Persian Emperor, Darius III himself. Darius had assembled an enormous army, probably double or triple Alexander's forces, and positioned them in a narrow coastal plain that actually nullified some of his numerical advantage. In a move of incredible audacity, Alexander personally led a cavalry charge directly at Darius's royal guard. Imagine the scene, the clang of bronze, the roar of thousands, and in the heart of it all, two emperors, one fighting for his empire, the other for his legacy. Darius, witnessing the collapse of his lines and the imminent threat to his person, famously fled the battlefield, leaving behind his entire family, his mother, wife, and children, who were subsequently captured by Alexander. This was a psychological blow of epic proportions. The great king, the king of kings, had fled. Alexander treated Darius's family with surprising respect, a move that further enhanced his image and, perhaps, subtly undermined Darius's authority among his own people. Instead of immediately pursuing Darius into the heart of Persia, Alexander made a strategic decision that showcases his genius. He secured the Mediterranean coast. He knew that as long as the Persian fleet had access to ports, they could pose a threat. This led to the legendary Siege of Tyre in 332 BCE. Tyre was an island city seemingly impregnable, but Alexander, with his characteristic stubbornness and engineering prowess, spent 7 months building a massive causeway, a land bridge, out to the island. It was an astonishing feat, a testament to his sheer will, and when Tyre finally fell, its inhabitants were brutally punished, a stark reminder of the cost of resistance. After Tyre, Alexander continued south, taking Gaza, and then entered Caire, Egypt. Here, he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule, a pharaoh, even a divine son of Amun by the oracle at Siwa. This wasn't just a conquest, it was a coronation. And in Egypt, he founded one of his most enduring legacies, the city of Alexandria, strategically located at the mouth of the Nile, destined to become one of the greatest centers of learning and trade in the ancient world. But the ultimate prize, the heart of the Persian Empire, still lay ahead. Darius III, desperate to reclaim his honor and his empire, had assembled another colossal army, even larger than the one at Issus, gathering forces from across his vast domain. The final, decisive showdown came in 331 BCE at the Battle of Gaugamela, near modern-day Mosul in Iraq. This was it, the culmination of everything. Darius had chosen a wide, open plain, perfect for his scythed chariots and his overwhelming numbers. He had even cleared the ground of obstacles to maximize their effect. But Alexander, ever the brilliant tactician, used a daring maneuver known as the oblique order, drawing the Persian cavalry wide, creating a gap in their center, and then, with a perfectly timed wedge formation, he plunged his companion cavalry straight towards Darius himself again. The battle was a chaotic, bloody maelstrom, and again Darius fled. Gaugamela wasn't just a victory, it was the death knell of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Persian army was shattered, its spirit broken. The road to the great Persian capitals now lay open. Alexander marched into Babylon. The ancient city that had seen so many empires rise and fall, and was welcomed as a liberator. The priests and people embraced him, seeing him as a restorer of order, a fulfillment of prophecy. He then moved on to Susa, one of the administrative capitals, seizing immense treasuries of gold and silver. His ultimate destination, though, was Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, the very heart of Persian power and pride. Persepolis was magnificent, a symbol of Achaemenid grandeur. Alexander plundered its vast wealth, and, in a moment that still sparks debate among historians, ordered its royal palace burned to the ground. Was it an act of calculated revenge for the Persian burning of Athens during the Persian Wars? Was it a drunken act of symbolic destruction? Or was it a deliberate statement that the old order was truly, irrevocably gone? Whatever the reason, the flames of Persepolis signalled the end of an era that had spanned over 2 centuries. Darius III, a king without an army or an empire, continued to flee east, a pathetic figure pursued by his conqueror. Alexander, now truly the quote 35, pursued him relentlessly, deep into what is now Afghanistan. In 330 BCE, Darius was assassinated by his own satrap, Bessus, who then proclaimed himself the new king. Alexander, upon finding Darius's body, surprisingly gave him a royal burial, claiming to avenge his death, thereby cementing his own legitimacy as the successor to the Persian throne. With Darius gone, the Achaemenid Empire was officially over, but Alexander didn't stop there. Here's what blows my mind about this man. His ambition was insatiable. He continued pushing his army further and further east, into Central Asia, into India, seeking the, quote, 36, quote. He fought fierce campaigns, established new cities, many named Alexandria, naturally, and even began to adopt Persian customs, wearing Persian dress, incorporating Persian soldiers into his army, and encouraging his officers to marry Persian women. This policy of, quote, 37, quote, of blending Greek and Persian cultures caused significant friction with his Macedonian veterans who felt he was abandoning their traditions. His soldiers, exhausted after years of relentless campaigning and thousands of miles from home, eventually mutinied in India, forcing him to turn back. The arduous journey through the Gedrosian desert was brutal, costing thousands of lives. He finally returned to Babylon, his new imperial capital, in 323 BCE, planning new campaigns, dreaming of conquering Arabia, perhaps even sailing around Africa. But it was not to be. In June of that year, in Babylon at the age of 32, Alexander the Great succumbed to a sudden illness, perhaps malaria, typhoid, or even poison, the true cause lost to history. Just like that, the man who had conquered the known world, who had forged an empire stretching from Greece to India in a mere decade, was gone. And here's the true paradox, the real game changer for the Middle East. Alexander left no clear successor. On his deathbed, when asked who should inherit his empire, he reportedly whispered, quote 38, quote, "What followed was nearly half a century of brutal internecine warfare known as the Wars of the Diadochi." The Cest, quote 39. His generals, these hardened, ambitious men who had fought alongside him, carved up his vast empire among themselves. Out of this chaos emerged three main Hellenistic kingdoms that would dominate the Middle East for centuries on. The Seleucid Empire. Founded by Seleucus the First Nicator, this was the largest, stretching from Anatolia through Mesopotamia, Persia, and into Central Asia. Its capital was Antioch in Syria. 2. The Ptolemaic Kingdom. Founded by Ptolemy the First Soter, this dynasty ruled Egypt, establishing Alexandria as its brilliant capital and a beacon of Greek learning and culture. 3. The Antigonid Kingdom. Based in Macedon and Greece, maintaining control over Alexander's homeland, while Alexander's empire itself was short-lived, his conquests had an absolutely profound, undeniable and permanent impact on the Middle East. He unleashed an unprecedented wave of Hellenization. Greek language became the lingua franca of administration, trade and culture across vast swaths of the former Persian Empire. Greek cities, like the many Alexandrias and Antiochs, sprang up everywhere, becoming centres of Greek art, architecture, philosophy and governance. The educated elite, even in historically non-Greek areas, often became bilingual, steeped in both local and Hellenic traditions. Think about the sheer scale of this cultural transformation. For centuries, the Middle East had been dominated by indigenous empires. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians. Now, suddenly, a new, foreign cultural layer was forcefully imposed, yet also enthusiastically adopted by many. This wasn't just a military conquest. It was a cultural revolution that reshaped everything from legal systems to coinage, from urban planning to intellectual thought. The echoes of Greek philosophy and science would resonate for centuries, influencing later Islamic scholarship. This new Hellenistic world, with its blend of Eastern traditions and Greek dynamism, was a vibrant, complex, and often turbulent place. It was a world where Greek generals became kings of ancient lands, where Egyptian pharaohs spoke Greek, and where the dust of forgotten empires now settled alongside the grand new temples and gymnasiums of a Hellenized elite. The Middle East, for the first time, was truly interconnected with the wider Mediterranean world in a way it had never been before, setting the stage for future empires and cultural exchanges that would define the next millennia. And it all started with one young man's impossible dream. The scale of it, the audacity, the sheer unadulterated impact, it's truly breathtaking.